Chapter 7 Army, Navy. We landed in the pathway of a huge armored tank. Move! Jacob shouted, grabbing my arm as the tank came barreling toward us. I leaped out of the way. So did Zach and Bo. But when I looked back to where we had been standing, George Washington was still there. We didn't have time to coordinate a rescue mission. All four of us jumped toward George Washington at the same time, knocking him sideways to the ground and away from the rolling tank. Whew! Bo breathed a sigh of relief. That was close. GW was almost flat as a pancake, Zach said. Laying his head back on the ground and sighing, I quickly stood up, realizing that GW was already on his feet. He was staring after the tank. What was that? A metal horse, he asked, looking confused. It's an armored tank. Army soldiers are protected as they ride in it, Jacob explained as he dusted dirt off his pants. We brought you to the future. To your future. It's now for us. We had brought George Washington to a modern army base. When I came up with the idea of bringing him here, it was to show him how the army worked in our time, to show him how people in America still fought for the freedoms of the Declaration of Independence. I thought that since he was a general, he'd like it, and I hoped it would inspire him to stay at Valley Forge. When your soldiers win the Revolutionary War, I said, America will become an independent country. America needs a different leader. I'm going home, George Washington told us. He couldn't keep his eyes off the tank. America needs you, Bo said with determination. The British will admit defeat and sign a peace treaty in 1782. They will go back to Britain. From then on, America will be independent and free. In 1787, the 13 colonies will unite into states. Today we have 50 United States of America. As the tank rolled farther away, I told George Washington everything I knew about the United States Army, which wasn't much. The United States Army defends our land, I said. They protect America and help to keep people in other countries safe, too. Today's Army does basically the same thing in our time as it did in yours, Jacob added. He also explained that similar to 1778, there are officers and infantry soldiers and that everyone gets paid, even generals. Suddenly we heard the sound of marching feet. Up, 2, 3, 4. A man's voice called out nearby. Up, 2, 3, 4. A group of soldiers in finely polished shoes and clean, crisp uniforms marched by. Our modern troops are well supplied, I told GW, pointing out the soldiers' clothing as they passed. I thought that at least one of the soldiers would have turned to look at some guy dressed like George Washington and a bunch of kids standing in the middle of the army base, but not one man or woman glanced our way. They stared straight ahead as they passed us by with rhythmic steps. Interesting, George Washington said. He began to walk away, heading to where the tank had turned a corner and disappeared. I like your army. I see that men and women soldiers are training together. Martha would also enjoy the warm climate here. I had asked Jacob to take us to an army base in California. I was tired of being cold at Valley Forge. I will remember this fondly when I am resting comfortably at Mount Vernon, George Washington said over his shoulder to us. Take me back to Valley Forge. I need to load the wagon. I looked to Zach to see if he wanted a turn at convincing GW, but he was busy thinking about something else. You can't quit Valley Forge, Jacob said, as we caught up with George Washington. GW had really long legs. Even though he was walking, we had to run to keep up. You have to go back and fight for freedom so America can exist. Without you, Jacob waved his arms around the base, there would be none of this. George Washington seemed to be considering Jacob's words. At least he stopped walking. It was possible that he stopped because he couldn't find the tank. No matter why, I was glad he was standing still. It was hard to convince him of anything while we were moving. Out of the blue, Zach cheered, I've got one! He'd been so quiet the whole time since we'd landed. I was surprised to hear his voice. Knock, knock. Zach, now's not the time for jokes. I glanced over at GW. Bo was still being courageous. He was peppering GW with army facts. I heard Bo say, after you win the Revolutionary War, we'll continue to need a strong army to protect us. Today's American army has more than 400,000 enlisted soldiers. and 76,000 officers. He was sharing statistics about the number of bases in both the United States and other countries when Zach said, "Come on, Abigail, let me tell you a joke. You don't want me to start complaining and worrying, do you?" Joking or whining? I wasn't sure which Zach I liked better. I gave up and said, "Who's there?" "Tank," Zach said with a smile. "Tank who?" I asked. "Tank you," Zach said, holding his side and laughing. I didn't laugh. "Jacob and Bo," I called out to where they stood, shaking my head at Zach's dopey joke. "This United States Army visit isn't working. Anyone got another idea?" Bo did. Seconds later, Jacob's thumbs flew over the computer buttons as he reprogrammed the settings. The glowing time travel hole opened in the ground. Bo, Jacob, and I caught the father of our country off guard by shoving him into the hole together. Zach followed us in, still laughing. A second later, we landed somewhere new. "Battle down the hatches!" a man's voice rang out. His command echoed through the narrow chamber we landed in. We were crammed into the radio room on a submarine. 2 chairs sat in front of a switchboard lit up with small red bulbs. We were lucky that no one else was in the room. It was a really small area. Suddenly, the submarine tilted downward and I crashed into GW. "Where are we?" he demanded to know. "Where have you taken me?" He seemed pretty stunned, so I asked Bo to explain. It was his idea to come here after all. "We are on a Navy submarine," Bo said, adding that the Navy is the second largest branch of the United States military. "Ah, yes. Together with John Barry, John Paul Jones, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, I started the Continental Navy in 1775, George Washington told us. We decided to gather together Army officers and soldiers who knew something about the sea. The Continental Navy had about 50 ships by the end of the Revolutionary War, Bo told him. Today, the United States Navy has about 281 ships and over 4,000 operational airplanes. Bo pointed around at the control panels in front of us. "We are on a Navy submarine." "What is a submarine?" GW asked us. I could tell he had a lot of questions brewing. I totally admire people who are as curious as I am. "A submarine is a special kind of boat that can travel underwater," Jacob told him. "And what is an airplane?" he wondered. Before I could explain what airplanes were, a woman in a blue uniform rushed into the room. "Oh no," she gasped when she saw us. "Didn't you get off with the tour group? We are headed out to sea on a training mission." "It's okay," Zach said with a wink. "We can just pop out of here anytime we want. No problem." "No problem?" She was nearly shouting at us. "This is a huge problem. The captain will have my head when he finds out I didn't sweep the sub for civilians before descent." As she said it, the submarine tilted again. I could feel us going down lower and lower into the sea. From somewhere outside the room, I heard a man's voice call out, "Up, periscope!" The woman looked frazzled. "All right," she said, taking a deep breath. "I'll get you out of here soon enough. First, I need to check the radio equipment to be sure it's working." The woman turned away from us and put on a pair of headphones. She began pressing buttons on a nearby control panel. 37 minutes left on the computer," Jacob announced. He looked at GW. "Pretty impressive, eh? Today we can fight battles, make sneak attacks, and protect America from under the sea. There are nearly 500,000 men and women serving in the U.S. Navy," Bo added. "All thanks to you for realizing the importance of defending our waters." "It's time to go back to Valley Forge and stay there," I told GW. "Now do you understand why? The ideas that we love and protect came from you and your friends." I stood on tiptoe to boldly get my face closer to George Washington's. "You were already fighting when the Declaration of Independence was signed. You led the Army and helped invent the Navy. The Continental Congress will appoint another leader to lead the fight at Valley Forge," he announced. "I want to sit in my favorite chair and warm my feet before the fire at my beloved home." GW headed over to where the woman was sitting. "But before we go," he added, "I'd like to learn more about this underwater boat." He searched for the right word, then said, "I mean submarine." He stood behind her as she twisted dials and pressed knobs, watching her every move. "Speaking of submarines," Zach said, raising his eyebrows at me, "what did the ocean say to the submarine?" I sighed loudly. I was getting really tired of Zach and his jokes. Jacob was busy with our computer, so Bo saved me and took this one. What? He replied. Nothing. It just waved, Zach said. It wasn't funny. Not even a tiny bit. Zach's jokes were getting worse as the day went on. I made my decision. Jacob had been right. A worried Zach was a lot better than a joke-telling one. I hoped he'd run out of jokes soon. I've got a new idea. Jacob looked up from the computer and everyone turned toward him. The woman turned around too. I'd almost forgotten about you, she said. I better go alert the captain. We're going to have to return to shore. She set down her headset and hurried from the room. Without another word, Jacob pressed wildly at the computer buttons, changing the settings. The time travel hole opened in the middle of the radio room floor. Where are we going now? I asked. Another place to convince George Washington, Jacob said. It's time to hit the skies. I thought I knew what he meant, but before I could ask, George Washington's voice boomed in the small room. Skies? What does that mean? I insist that you take me back to Valley Forge now. I must saddle my horse and begin my journey. He stood tall and shouted, That's an order. Clearly, GW wasn't going to be tricked or pushed into going anywhere else. I pinched my lips together, trying to figure out how to get GW into the hole before it closed. If you can't bring GW to the hole, Jacob said, frantically pushing buttons on the computer, maybe I could bring the hole to GW. Jacob is so super-duper smart at computers. If there was a way, I knew he'd find it. The time travel hole was beginning to shrink. So far, none of us had leaped into it. I was starting to feel nervous when suddenly the hole started to move. It was slinking across the floor like a snake. It's working! Zach gave his brother a big thumbs up. Bo slapped Jacob heartedly on the back. And a second later, the hole crept right under George Washington, gobbling him up. I heard him shout, No! As he fell in. Way to go, Jacob! I gave him a high five as I jumped in following GW. The boys leaped in after me. Chapter 8. Air Force. Grab your parachutes, airmen. It's time to go. A commanding officer in a jumpsuit was speaking to rows of men and women lined up on benches. Jacob, I cried. Tell me you didn't bring us to... Yup, Jacob smiled, showing all his teeth. We're flying high with the United States Air Force. If seeing the Air Force doesn't amaze GW and convince him to stay at Valley Forge, nothing will. He looked at the computer and groaned. We only have 30 minutes left. We'd landed in the back of an airplane. It wasn't like any regular airplane I'd taken on vacation. There were no nice cushy seats or flight attendants with drink carts. Basically, it looked like the whole plane had been emptied out, leaving rows of benches and nothing else. All the airmen on the plane were busy putting on their parachutes. I knew it wouldn't be long before someone noticed us. I quickly turned to Bo. Maybe there were some Air Force facts swimming around in his head that would help. In 1947, Bo said, another part of the American military was created. It is called the United States Air Force. Bo was still acting pretty bold. I hoped it would last until we convinced GW. GW looked blankly at Bo, but Bo went on anyway. The Air Force has 358,600 men and women serving on it, and about 9,000 airplanes. Airplanes? GW asked. I'd forgotten we never explained about airplanes to him. In December 1903, two brothers invented a machine that could fly, Zach told him. I was relieved that he wasn't telling GW any airplane jokes. Yet. Since then, people have been building better and better flying machines. We call them airplanes. Are we in an airplane now? George Washington looked around. Of course he didn't know we were in an airplane. We were nowhere near a window. For all he knew, we were in a silver metal tunnel with benches. We're flying very high above the ground, I replied, as high as the clouds. The United States military got even stronger after airplanes were added. Planes could move people around the world quickly, bringing supplies and even dropping bombs. I know bombs, George Washington said, recognizing the words. We used those types of exploding weapons in the Revolutionary War. He sighed. Maybe we could win the war if I had one of these flying machines. The British would be caught unawares. Finally, he was thinking about ways to win the Revolutionary War. That was a change, even if he wanted to use airplanes to do it. You won't need an airplane to win the war, Bo told him. GW nodded, considering Bo's words. We were getting even closer to convincing him. Jacob checked the computer and warned us. 25 minutes. Then he asked GW, "Are you ready to go back to Valley Forge and prepare to fight?" George Washington paused. I could see he was really thinking about everything we'd said and what we'd shown him. "Don't forget about the rights that your friends wrote in the Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Bo was giving it one last try. "Everything we know in our world depends on you giving back to Valley Forge and leading the battles to guarantee us those rights. It's why you're known as the father of our country." I put in, crossing my fingers that we'd finally convinced him. "The father of your country?" GW shook his head. "I do not understand." "It's what everyone in the future will call you." I was ready to drop to my knees and start begging. "You have to go back to Valley Forge and stay there." George Washington looked at me carefully. I swear I could see the change in his eye. Maybe we'd gotten through to him at last. Martha was right. He sure was stubborn. George Washington opened his mouth to speak when suddenly the Air Force officer at the front of the plane called to him, "You there, grab your parachute. It's time to go." GW strode to the front of the plane saying, "I am struggling to decide between retiring to my comfortable home in Virginia or remaining in the unpleasantness of Valley Forge. Where else am I meant to be going?" "If you're on my plane," the officer said, "you'll be going out there." And with that, he pointed out the open door of the plane. We'd been talking so much, I hadn't noticed the plane was now empty. All the airmen had parachuted away. The officer handed GW a parachute and quickly reviewed how to put it on and open it. To my amazement, GW did as he was told without argument. What was he thinking? Bo, Jacob, Zach, and I hurried forward to prevent GW from jumping. The man led GW to the door. "Bend your knees and jump," he advised. Then, as an afterthought, added, "Your uniform is not regulation. See the supply officer on base when we get back." "I will have you know," GW said as he bent his knees, "I designed this uniform myself." And with that, the father of our country leaped out of the plane. "Oh, no!" I shrieked. It all happened so fast, we didn't have enough time to stop him. "I know what to do." Zach quickly shared his idea with Jacob. We rushed to the door of the plane. "I don't know how you children got on board," the officer told us, "but parachuting is for airmen only. You'll ride to the airport with the pilot. We'll make arrangements for you to be returned to your parents from there." "No need," Jacob said, frantically stabbing at buttons on the computer before slipping in the cartridge. Turning to us, Jacob warned, "Jump carefully. You gotta aim your feet toward the center of the time travel hole." Out the door of the plane, I could see the glowing hole shimmering just below George Washington. With his parachute open, he glided gently down through the smoke. "This is crazy," Zach said. "I'm about to jump out of a speeding plane without a parachute." But am I complaining? No. He grinned as he bent his knees, preparing to leap. "What did Geronimo say when he jumped out of the airplane?" he asked. "I have no idea," I said, taking his hand in mine. I was too scared to jump alone. "Me!" he cried out as we jumped together. The last thing I heard as I fell through the time travel hole was the Air Force officer shouting at Bo and Jacob with great concern, "You kids don't have parachutes!" Jacob replied, "Thanks, but we don't need them."